If you want to take a deep dive into the nature of reality, then I'd suggest that you read The Denial of Death by Ernst Becker. Man, what a book. He doesn't pull any punches. In fact, sadly enough, he died before his book was actually published. He died from cancer, and so it was an opportunity to put into practice everything he'd written about the topic. Now, Becker was not a nobody. He was a very well-known psychologist and sociologist, and his book was a candidate for the Pulitzer Prize. So it's not a book written by some self-made New Age type person. This book is deep, and it will go as deep as you want to go. So let me tell you what for me was the most startling revelation in this book. If you've studied psychology at all, you will know that a lot of emphasis over the past century has been placed on the relationship between parents and children. And indeed those things are important, but they're not the most important. So we hear about things like the Oedipus complex, where a child, a boy say, wants to have sex with his mother and murder his father, and the opposite with a female child. And we hear of narcissism and all of these things, and the damage that parents can do to children, and it's real enough. But this is not the bottom line in all of this. The thing that really fucks up a child is existence itself. And this is the most horrifying and illuminating thing that I came across in this book. And this is a problem for psychiatrists, because they realize that actually there is nothing that can be done about this. When a child's born, it suffers an existential crisis, and that existential crisis continues all the way through its life, although by the age of 6 or 7 it's already starting to cover the whole thing over with trivialities, unnecessarily so. So by the time a child is 5 or 6, it starts to indulge in fairy tales and imagination, because it needs to get away from the harsh reality of life. And when you see a child pulling the wings off a butterfly or the legs off a spider, that child isn't actually just doing it willy-nilly. What the child is actually doing is exploring the horror of reality. And when you see a child do something like that, you'll see a strange fascination in its face. It can't believe that something that's alive can be dismembered in that kind of way. And I actually remember as a child, and this is a horrible revelation, but putting about 20 ants in a metal pan and frying them over a fire, and being grief-stricken that I'd done that to those ants. Because one minute they were alive, and then they started running around furiously, and then they stopped running around, and they died. So this is the terror of reality that faces children. And this is the, how can I put it, this is the ground zero for psychological damage. And it's inevitable. There's nothing we can do about it. This is the great dilemma for psychiatrists today, that they know that in the main the damage that is done to us through life, through the terror of life, is not something that can be repaired. Now the way we deal with this is very, very well outlined in the document by Zapffer. It's called The Last Messiah. In fact, if you go to my website, corporealfantasy.com, and go to the Zapffer article, you can download the Last Messiah. It's just a free document you can download there. And Zapffer very, very articulately details the things that we can do to effectively sublimate this terror of life. The first thing we do is we isolate all the thoughts that we have around life, around the terror of the situation. So we don't think about death. We don't think about illnesses and horrific things that happen to people. We isolate it. We isolate those thoughts from our main consciousness and put them away into a little box. The problem is the little box isn't completely soundproof, and so we still hear that voice talking to us, but we choose to ignore it. The second thing we do is we anchor. We find something to base our life around, which might be an ambition to be a millionaire, to be a great musician, to be a great physicist, or whatever, to be a celebrity. All of these things are anchoring. They take our mind off the most pressing issue, which is our approaching death. And the third one is distraction, which is basically entertainment, sports, you name it, any one of a million things that we do to distract ourselves from the reality of life. And the fourth one, which is the most subtle one, is sublimation. And sublimation is essentially to wrap up the whole horrific story into some kind of myth or fable. And it may be that you could see Christianity like that it's all a pile of crap, but actually we're going to be saved, or there's some deliverance after death, or whatever. So we sublimate the whole thing. So back to the book by Becker. He quotes Frederick Perls quite extensively. Now, Frederick Perls was the founder of the Gestalt movement, and for various reasons I became very familiar with the Gestalt methods a couple of decades ago, actually, and even went for some training. And Gestalt is very, very deep, very deep. In fact, it's worth reading Perls' books. They'll give you some astonishing insights into life. But Perls said that there are 4 levels of existence for a human being. The top 2 are the ones where we live all our life. They're the superficial things, just ordinary interactions with other people, our fascinations, our hobbies, our life aims, all the superficial stuff that we build to detract ourselves from the reality of life. And then you come down to a layer, so those are the top 2 layers, and you come down to a layer, the third layer, which is the realization of our emptiness. And this is a hard one for most people to face. In fact, the reason they distract themselves so much is that they simply do not want to go into that pain of realizing their own emptiness, their own nothingness. Something that Gurdjieff talked about a great deal. But there's a layer below that one, and that layer is the terror of death. And almost no one goes down to that level because it's almost unbearable. As Gurdjieff said, a man cannot contemplate in sincerity his own death because it's just too horrific. I'll have more to say on that in a moment. So the death terror is the ultimate, the ultimate barrier to seeing reality. And it's almost like 2 north poles repelling each other, our ordinary consciousness and this consciousness of this terror of death. And so that's a very, very profound insight. And as I've mentioned, Becker goes into, to a large extent, for me a little bit too much in actual fact, but he goes into the history of psychology over the past 150 years. And he focuses a great deal on Freud, as you would expect. And Freud, as you know, considered that the main neurosis was around sexuality, and that all of our deviant behavior was some response to our sexual inhibitions and to our sexual repression. Towards the end of his life, Freud changed his mind about that and realized that the main terror, the main cause of our neurosis, was actually the terror of life. Not even the terror of death, but the terror of life. And his work was complemented by many others who are mentioned in the book. And today psychiatrists know that basically is the problem that cannot be got around. We're born into this world, and by the age of 4 or 5 we have been traumatized by the reality of life, and we have to start doing all those things I mentioned earlier: isolation, anchoring, distraction, sublimation. And we do those things to make life bearable for ourselves. Now, I want to end this one with just a brief discussion about Gurdjieff, because it's clear that Gurdjieff got right to the heart of the whole thing, because he said that the most useful thing someone can do is to contemplate their own death on a regular basis, to do it with as much sincerity and intensity as they can. And in fact, this is something the Dalai Lama does every day. Every day for half an hour he contemplates his own death. And there's a long tradition here in the Tao Te Ching. It says a man that goes to his death with his eyes closed is in a pretty sorry state. So Gurdjieff's insistence that we contemplate our own death on a regular basis is actually very great wisdom, because what we do is we effectively square up to the terror that sits within us, and maybe eventually we find that that terror is not quite as horrific as we thought, and is not as damaging as actually trying to evade it. The evasion of it is more damaging than the realization of it. So if you are interested in reality, in facing up to your own existential terror, then Mr. Gurdjieff's advice is very, very good advice. It's something I do every day, and it creates a certain inner strength, and you would expect it to do that, because actually this terror of death is otherwise undermining almost everything you do, because to substitute, to compensate for this terror, we're normally doing pretty stupid things, like getting all excited about getting a new car, or getting all excited about a new partner, anything other than face the stark reality of our existence. Anyway, the book by Becker, The Denial of Death, is very highly recommended. For me personally, there are some chapters that just drone on a little bit too much about Freud and the history of Freud, but other than that, be prepared to be shocked to the core of your being, and hopefully that will have some beneficial effects for you.